Welcome back. It's certainly been a bit. In light of the fact that the vast majority of this pack is now an exercise in checkbox clicking, I have opted to space out episodes substantially in favor of compressing the progression down to something that is actually interesting to watch. If you recall, at the end of the last episode, I was simultaneously celebrating and bemoaning the creation of my first fusion reactor. Celebrating because it is a substantial progression milestone, and bemoaning because fusion just kind of sucks for producing power right now. That's fine though, because even though power is nice, I have other solutions coming down the pipe to handle that little problem. Now the real point of this was for its exotic crafting capacities. What does fusion let me craft, you ask? Simple. Liquid Europeans. Or Europium, if you want to be pedantic about the whole thing. This delightful tutti frutti flavored brand of stupid is used to create a small handful of crystal chips, which I can then break down and replicate. The actual process is utterly irrelevant, but it isn't terribly complicated, is what I would like to say. If you're willing to do it with pure liquid Europeans, the process is quite simple. I, unfortunately, am not, and the other option involves using Martian space bacteria and lots of tasty ionizing radiation. Trouble being, Mars doesn't exist, so getting the bacteria requires summoning no less than 3 different meteors, upgrading my juice altar to tier 6, learning how to culture, ferment, and mass-produce bacteria, and then scaling that to the point where it will be profitable, so I'm just gonna push through with the Europeans for now. Except no, actually I won't, because I need better meteors for multiple other secret projects anyway. This game, this game. Fun fact about the Tier 6 altar upgrade process, some of the infusions require an Essentia aspect named Tempestus, the aspect of weather. Normally, this is trivially easy to source. You just fly up, grab some clouds, come back down, melt the clouds into juice, and off you go. Well, I don't have clouds, and nobody bothered to write down a good alternative source on the stuff through any of the wikis that I was looking through, so I get to use the only other one I know of, which is lightning creepers. Killing a lightning creeper with a vaporizing enchanted weapon has a chance of dropping precisely 1 crystallized Tempestus. How much do I need? Oh, some. Good thing I already have a modularized mob farm design that will let me automatically crank out industrial amounts of creepers to try and farm out the specific kind of rare mob I need for a chance at getting a single correct item to drop, right? What can I say? If New Horizons wants to make this an MMO, you better believe I'm going to turn an army of bots loose on it, because at this point, meta optimization is the only way I will remain sane. Ecstatic levels of stupidity aside, I eventually do get my final altar upgrade finished. You do not know, and do not want to know, what it took to make this thing, though I will say that I learned you can stack world accelerators in the process, so that should give you at least a little bit of a hint. This lets me upgrade to a Transcendent tier juice box, allowing me to store an excessive, I don't even know, 30 million with upgrades? It's a lot. And I can't be bothered to do any of the math. The point is that it's enough to unlock a bunch of wonderfully useful meteor types that allow me to do some, circumventing of those precision issues that I've been having with my technology base. In the interim, I finish up with my crystal processor circuitry line and learn how to make stinky radioactive poop water while subjecting myself to the wonderful pleasure that is this anytime I go within 20 blocks of my bacteria vat. The former has obvious practical applications. The latter I'm less convinced about because it doesn't really seem to cost all that many Europeans to make a crystal processor, but hey, in for the penny, in for the pound. At the very least, the process did end up being a lot simpler than I worried about. The wikis had a bunch of terrifying instructions about doing magical real-life genetic modification, but it turns out you can just kind of ignore the part where the cultures say, I can't be used in a bacterial vat, and use them in a bacterial vat anyway. I'm not sure what the deal is with that, but I'm not going to complain. It still takes forever, but that isn't anything new. Welcome to ZPM, by the way. Only 5 tiers to go. This particular tier doesn't seem to have a whole lot of really terrible things in it, and that terrifies me because that probably means the questbook authors just never played this far and started making things up. Before I start getting too spicy, though, we have a problem to fix. Octuple vac nuke setups are great and all, but the problem is that they are not, in fact, all that great, and I have outscaled their power output pretty badly by now. Because I'm in a void world, the intended power production methods opened up with fusion reactors are pretty impractical thanks to their requiring bedrockium, and I can't really be bothered to spam out more fusion reactors. There are ways around this. Apparently there's some extra large turbo steam turbine stuff that you can do if you pump the plasma into a teapot and stick a fan on the end of it, but that sounds lame and stupid and requires me to understand how steam boilers work, which is not likely to happen because I am also lame and stupid. Instead, I'm just going to be dumb in a novel and creative way and just do nuclear power harder. With the unlocking of crystal marine frames and tier 6 meteor summoning, I have once again sort of maybe entirely tier skipped the kinds of ores that I should normally be able to get a hold of at this point in the game. Instead of a slow, energy-intensive, and annoying refinement line to scrape up scraps of rare materials, I can now summon them in bulk way earlier than you should be able to normally. Case in point, I now have a bulk source of Tiberium, no refinement needed, and this lets me do some very special things. You see, uranium isn't the only thing you can burn in a reactor for power. Most of the other options are kind of weird or fiddly or just straight up are pointlessly expensive, but there are a couple that caught my attention. The first is something called high-density uranium. It's uranium, but it has a higher density, somehow, which magically lets it produce double the power for a little while longer without increasing its heat output whatsoever, because that is definitely how nuclear fission works. It's nice, I guess, but doubling my power output isn't really going to do more than maybe slow the brownouts down a bit, so I need a spicier fuel source. Introducing the core. Capitalized T, capitalized C. The point of this is, I assume, to have a reactor that uses one fuel rod instead of a bunch of little fiddly ones, and the core has a whopping 108,000 EU per tick energy output before adjacency bonuses, meaning that one core rod on its own will produce about as much power as 3 fully loaded up traditional uranium vac nukes. It also produces some heat, but it doesn't really matter how much heat because it's enough heat that if the core is ever uncooled for a single game tick, the reactor will instantly detonate, at which point the numbers kind of stop mattering. I'm interested. Tell me more. The best part about the core is that, unlike what is implied by the name, you don't actually have to limit yourself to one. In fact, there's a reactor design buried way at the end of the tutorial labeled "For the Truly Insane," which I assume was just a typo that should have instead read "For Goose's personal use." It uses 40 the cores to produce a hair under 8 million EU per tick, which is roughly the same energy output as 31 of my existing vac nuke setups running in parallel. That sounds great. I'll take all of them. Well, when I say all, I actually just mean 2 for now. With the design that I went with, I will have 14 coolant cells that reach the 25% extraction threshold in about 17 seconds of runtime. Cooling the cells takes around 1.7 seconds each in a Louvre tier vacuum freezer, and at 14 coolant cells per reactor, that means there will need to be downtime on each system independent of the time needed to swap the coolant out. I solved this by switching to a second independent reactor and cooler setup when the first one is down. This means I will have, if I need it, an uninterrupted power supply somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 amps of ZPM power, using only 2 reactors, 2 vacuum freezers, a jungle of redstone, and a design that firmly falls under the category of dude just trust me. If you ignore the process of crafting all of the cores, which will end up eating somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 tungsten steel, the rest of the build is pretty simple. The most expensive and time-consuming part, by far, was getting the refined Nequadria that I needed to make the batteries to buffer the thing, but once you ignore the power requirements and the fact that it requires yet another neutron accelerator to make the stuff, it wasn't all that bad. I would have needed Nequadria refinement anyway, so really all this project did was force me to prepare ahead a little bit. In the meantime, my work continues. I finally got enough samples of Martian space bacteria to grow a colony of it, which I thought would allow me to produce infinite amounts of the stuff, but I realized after I did all the work to get it that I need to upgrade the bacteria vat, and that upgrade requires several hundred osmium. Conveniently, part of my Tier 6 juice altar allows me to summon enormous blobs of crude osmium from the sky, allowing me to skip most of the arduous refinement process that I was using to collect the barest scraps of it earlier. This would be great news if my ore processing system wasn't massively backlogged due to power shortages, but it is, so yeah. I will not be doing much with this for a while. Speaking of massive power shortages, a full The Core loadout for my reactors is, not gonna be happening for a bit. They are just too expensive, and I don't feel like letting the game run overnight so my factories can poop out all of the stuff that I would need. I decided for now that I will just stick to using 8 of the cores, since that's still going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 EU per tick, which is already a massive upgrade. All I should need to do is cram these in and install a panic switch, because inevitably something is going to go wrong. And yeah, I'm not disappointed at all. The cells didn't get heated up enough, and the auto-extract cycle didn't catch them because of that. This is precisely why we have a panic switch, folks, because that little accident there just identified a flaw in my redstone wiring that would have blown my base sky high once the system started power throttling. Once that's fixed, the too long didn't read explanation is that the old system's power throttling mechanism pauses the coolant loop, and if you get a bad power cycle, there is a chance that accumulated heat could skip over the cooling cycle and melt the coolant cells before their next cycle came around. To fix this, I decoupled the coolant loop from the power throttle system entirely and increased the reactor handover speed enough so that regardless of when the handover happens, the heat from a full power cycle plus residual will never be enough to melt the cell. But in doing this whole system got substantially spookier to work with. I'm making do with 512k coolant cells because the 1024s need materials that I can't process yet, and that limitation has forced me to rework the handover timing in a way best described as pants-wettingly terrifying, which is not really a description you want to associate with a nuclear reactor's safety protocols. The whole experience was not helped by the fact that warp creeper explosions sound exactly like reactors popping their lids. Now that I am the proud owner of the world's most stressful, brand new, sort of technically if you squint just right scalable power source, it's time to solve some problems in incredibly cursed ways. EBFing takes way too long and is stupid and stinky. I can't fix stupid, but the stinky part is mitigatable with upgraded muffler hatches, and the taking way too long part can be solved by doing more of it. Welcome to my new EBF hallway. This entire complex will be filled with nothing but volcanuses and cryogenic freezers, and I hate it. Since each EBF fully monopolizes the power output of a single core, this means its first project is going to be making many more of them, and figuring out how to turn them into power efficiently and then dumping the power in here. The whole production process for this is once again stalled when I discover another critical flaw introduced by my changes to the redstone system, and the only reason this didn't blow up in my face was due to the incredible amount of reactor plating I installed to fill up air gaps in my design. Fixing this required a complete rework of the timing circuits again, but I needed to rework them anyway so I could work in independent power throttling for different banks of reactors. I did finally land on a system that seems stable and scalable though, and it only took like 3 hours of my life and half a pad of sticky notes because for some reason I don't have actual scratch paper next to my desk, but I consider all of that a small price to pay for not wetting my pants every time a creeper explodes near me. While we're at it, it's time for vacuum freezer upgrades as well. I have no idea how many I will need, but I imagine 4 of them on low voltage is probably going to be enough for now, seeing that that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 times the amount of cooling power as my last setups combined. But, wait, you know what's better than 4 volcanuses? 8. Because 8 is twice as much as 4, so that means it's twice as good. TPS? Did you mean to say GPS? You don't need one of those because I'm pretty sure you already know where we're going with this. And if you guessed 12 volcanuses, you're right! You're such a smart little cookie. Yes, you are. Here, have a gold star on me. Boy, howdy do I sure love zero-skill scaling mechanics that require you to do the same stupid thing over and over to progress, with no end in sight without any hope of interesting technological developments or room to meta-optimize. I really enjoy systems that only serve to monopolize people's free time without providing any meaningful rewards or inspiring novel solutions to cleverly engineered mechanics. With all of this work done, my smelting problem hasn't gone away entirely, but it is certainly more manageable now that I have disposable power to throw at it. Speaking of which, I need more of that, which means it's time to do some remodeling on my power trunk already. I'm not entirely certain what was wrong with me when I designed the power throttling system for my back nuke designs, but it is about 500% more complicated than is necessary, and makes zero sense in the context of a more powerful system that can overwhelm the power throughput of a 16 amp battery buffer. Keep it simple, stupid kind of doesn't do it justice. The world will not end if you use vanilla redstone in your massive multi-mod nuclear reactor plant. You get an upgrade. And you get an upgrade. You, sir, you have won a brand new Louvre tier energy hatch for absolutely free. I can provide enough power output to run 16 of these things concurrently, in addition to whatever power my EBF systems draw, which means everyone gets a Louvre tier energy hatch. And I'm only producing at maybe 20% energy capacity due to a shortage of fuel rod cores, so there is zero reason to not be upgrading these things at this point. While my terrible Oprah bit is going on in the background, it's Gregtech as normal. ZPM brings with it an entirely new component suite that requires an entirely new assembly line to produce. At some point in the future, a machine will unlock that gets rid of the stupid 16 USB stick limit on assembly lines, but for now I don't have enough storage space for them and am too lazy to bother automating the insertion and removal, which means that I get to make an entirely second system. Truly, a tale as old as Gregtech itself. Why be smart when you can just lag the server instead? Concurrent to the theme of more is more better, it's now worth considering the use of mega chemical reactors, or MCRs, which are the phenomenally oversized big sibling of the large chemical reactor currently forming the backbone of my chemical production lines. Large chemical reactors naturally have perfect overclocking, which means cramming more electricity into them is a wholly viable strategy for early game scaling, but past a certain point the recipes are so cheap that they are completed in a single tick, regardless of how much power you feed them. MCRs get around this problem by being able to complete a whopping 256 crafting iterations per processing cycle, which allows you to cram way more electricity into them before diminishing returns start kicking in. In fact, they process things so quickly that your material provisioning setups will usually bottleneck you far more than the machine itself will, which necessitates some AE2 jank I stole entirely from a tutorial by Divran, who also did the wiring diagram for my assembly line, that I also stole. The key mechanic here is that interfaces and fluid peer-to-peer networks don't have a limit to the amount of stuff they can transfer, and you can exploit this with subnets and precisely configured blah-blah to create stupidly precise high-put blah-blah through any blah-blah in the game. The rest of it falls firmly in the category of dude just trust me, because I kid you not, some of this is more annoying than actually configuring real-life computer networks is. As infuriating as it may be to set up, you really can't argue with the results though. By exploiting the power of context-dependent crafting, I can now offload a massive amount of my passive material production onto this one machine, while still leaving it capable of certain on-demand bulk processing builds without mixing the recipes up too much. I really wish I could explain how I did this, because that seems like it would be a very relevant and useful piece of information for people who are playing the pack alongside me, but I honestly have no idea. I will tell you one thing though, it's sure nice to be able to effectively hit problems with a just do it more stick again. Anyway, after dealing with all the knock-on effects of having my chemical reaction backlog expunged with a level of grace I can only compare to the after effects of throwing a pipe bomb into a septic tank, I move on with my life. ZPM components require a substantial amount of liquefied Europeans, and the only meteor with its ore is one that requires a summoning catalyst I can't make yet, so for now that requirement will be satisfied via appalling amounts of monazite processing, but yeah, that's gonna be a problem. Meanwhile, it's time to call in a cleanup on Aisle U, because as fantastic as they've been, my traditional vac nuke setups don't really have a use anymore. I don't need nuclear byproducts for the moment, and the existing design really is not laid out right for doing anything effectively. If I do ever end up needing them again, it will simply be far more efficient to rebuild them from scratch and do it correctly this time. Once I'm done mopping up the enormous radioactive slag ball some inconsiderate customer left underneath my basement, it's back to work. Aside from Europeans, ZPM material demands are basically a non-issue thanks to my over-matured factory system, which means after a few minutes of recipe programming, my main contribution to the whole process is watching YouTube videos and listening to tortured gas noises while my ME system very, very slowly squeezes through the badly designed progression bottlenecks of the tier. The first of these is watching a batch of brand new trinium coil blocks craft in the required to use single block assembly machine. Each of them takes 50 seconds to craft for no reason whatsoever, as per usual. I spend more energy flushing a Greg toilet at this point than the assembler will ever consume, so this time restriction is entirely put in to make it seem like you're doing something and has no effective purpose. Because I need 42 of these coil blocks, this means I waste half an hour on this step alone. With those coils, I then get to enjoy the wonderful privilege of smelting fancy expensive superconductive dust down. I was going to complain about how long it took to smelt, but with 4 volcanuses using trinium coils and helium gas and Louvre energy hatches and every other speed modifier I can possibly find, they only average out to about 1 every 3 seconds, which is honestly quite tolerable as this pack goes. Less tolerable is the 1 minute per superconductive wire batch, but I only need 4 batches, so I'm not gonna complain too much. And then I get to sit around waiting on the first batch of energy hatches to finish, which really didn't have to take this long. It was just delayed because I forgot to pre-craft the circuits for them, so I will retract my earlier complaints. The only thing that was really dumb here was waiting on the single block assembly machine. If I were being optimal, I would make sure my first round of energy hatches are placed on machines that increase the speed of energy hatch production, but I mostly just stopped to upgrade whatever was the easiest to rewire first, which happened to be my circuit assembly lines. When I redid my power logistics, I plumbed most of my main base with ZPM-capable signalum cable, which means the whole procedure is as simple as ripping out all the old step-down transformers and replacing the cables and hatches. This has the unfortunate side effect of requiring me to replace the glass in the machine so that they can use said energy hatches, though, which in and of itself requires me to craft something called a Vajra. For reasons beyond my comprehension, the glass used in Gregtech multi-blocks is ridiculously impossible to break, meaning I got to add yet another random tool to my toolkit, specifically for the purpose of removing half a dozen different kinds of blocks. In the Vajra's case, though, it was more than worth the backpack space because the Vajra can break anything from just about any mod ever, but still, the principle remains. There is no reason for this glass to take this long to break. And then for the next 8 hours or so, nothing much interesting happens. The only material shortage that I had, namely europium, isn't solved, but I substantially mitigated the problem by lobbing 4 Louvre tier electromagnetic separators onto a branch line, feeding them infinite monazite byproducts and forgetting about them, which means really the only significant blocker to expansion is the ratio of nuclear reactor upgrades to every other kind of upgrade that I need to install. This ended up being rather more obnoxious than you might expect, because when I redid my power lines, I removed all the buffer capacity, which means that when I run out of power, my entire factory shuts down, but I survived. I also spent quite a lot of time on conflict resolution with my chemical reactor setups. I obviously want to try and cram in as many recipes as possible into my 1 megachemical reactor, and while that part wasn't so bad, doing it forced me to go back through and uproot all of the delicately balanced passive chemical lines that I had silently kludged together in the background. When I started doing that, I was immediately assaulted by all of the skeletons I had crammed into the closet when setting them up in the first place, and ended up exposing a bunch of hidden processing backlogs that required machine upgrades in entirely unrelated parts of my base to clear out. In other news, I'm now sporting 2 Dagnote distillases, 2 brand new maxed out EBFs solely for passive production, a entirely new dedicated autoclave system, a dedicated alloy smelting system, and a sifting machine overclocked to ZPM because monazite processing has no chill. The rest of the tier is such a breeze, in fact, that I only started running into issues right as I'm ready to finish up the second tier of Fusion Reactor, which is the multi-block that gates all of the UV tier. Making this lovely fellow requires a concerning amount of Cenarium. Normally, you're expected to produce this with a fusion reactor, because fusion reactors are kind of essential to game progression or something. Problem being, I think fusion is stinky and I can't be bothered, so instead it's time to bring back some old friends to do it for me. First stop, welcome back to the Night Metal farm. Well, calling it a farm is generous, but we can go with production area. As you may have guessed from its name, I need to make a quick trip to pick up some more of the stuff for a very special toy. Unlike my previous farming adventure, I'm now equipped with a moderately decent looting enchanted spike of around 180 levels, so as you can imagine, this was a very short trip. My freshly minted night metal is then combined with a bunch of other random junk to make yet another massively overcomplicated Thaumcraft adjacent biome changing apparatus. This time, at least, there is a better reason for it than me wanting a cat. When fed Centivis and the appropriate varieties of Essentia, the Arcane Terrestrial Reformer will randomly change bits of the surrounding biome into the biome specified by a fancy block placed on top of it. This machine is cripplingly slow and requires a whopping 64 Tempestus to make, so yay for MMO grinding, but it does offer one advantage in that it isn't witchery or a juice magic ritual, and as such is about 5,000 times less annoying to use if you only need to change a single block of biome. Of course, if I'm creating vanilla biomes on demand, that can only mean one thing, and that one thing is that it's time for my most favoritist thing to do with my free time ever: bee breeding! To be quite honest, it really isn't that bad anymore. My technology base has come a long way since the last time I had to grind out bees, and between frames of frenzy and high-voltage world accelerators overclocking the living daylights out of everything, I can crank out new species faster than my fingers can click the buttons for them. With this excessively overclocked new tech, I quickly hammer out my Cenarium solution. It is, unsurprisingly, a bee! Wow, amazing! Now we just need to scale the living daylights out of the sucker. This is actually a lot easier than it sounds, because it used to be your best and only bet for scalable bee-based production was don't, with a distant second of cram a few dozen world accelerators with alvearies on top into your base, literally anywhere you can find spare room. This solution worked fine for absolutely everyone and had no drawbacks whatsoever until some stuck-up server owners started whining about playability, lag, and sub-integer TPS rates, and in response the dev team rebalanced these entirely and cranked out a custom alveary system with an integrated world accelerator that solves all of those problems. Meet the industrial apiary. It does stuff and things, and more importantly, its stuff and things scale with the amount of power you give it. And boy oh boy do I have a whole lot of power that I can give it. In fact, I have so much power to give it that I opted to make 4 of them and just threw them down wherever. This will net me infinite, zero-maintenance Cenarium production at a rate of about 2 per second for the cost of 3-ish amps of Louvre tier power, with room to scale as much as I want, which makes my Cenarium problems a pretty solved issue for the foreseeable future. Weirdly, the machines do seem to have some issues with Ender IO item conduits, but Gregtech item pipes work just fine when you actually put them on the correct side of the machine, so I just fully intend to plumb these things up and never turn them off again. Even with Cenarium dealt with, I'm not quite out of the woods just yet though. My next material demand is for something called neutronium, which, as the quest book so eloquently puts it, is normally a material only found in the center of stars. Naturally, I can summon a big old blob of it from the sky and mine it with a drill just fine, because logic, but the summoning part requires a particularly excessive 100 million LP, which means my juice altar is in need of some more upgrades. Rather than count the number of upgrades, I opted to instead just make 2 stacks of ingredients for them and keep slamming them on until I reached 100 million, because goodness knows I'm gonna have a use for them later anyway. Neutronium aside, the second level of fusion reactor goes in sort of without a hitch. I failed to do basic math and forgot how to count things, and as such did not make 3/4 of its plating correctly, but it's cheap and easy to produce. So a bit more faffing around with my autocrafters and the reactors finished up without issues. Tier 2 reactors allow me to make a bunch of things, but the most immediately relevant is americium and tritanium. The former is used for all of the next tier of components in quantities best described as too much, and naturally the production rate of it is stupidly slow, so I will most likely end up languishing on ZPM a bit in the next episode while I scale up its refinement speed. Meanwhile, with more altar upgrades than I ever planned on making, it is now possible for me to summon neutronium, meaning that I am now technically capable of moving on to UV. In reality, I'm nowhere close, and the act of making more than a handful of motors would entirely bankrupt me, but that is a problem that I will need to solve in the next episode. Nothing episodes will continue to be quite slow to produce, but I hope that my next series will capture a lot of the janky charm of this one while allowing for progress to be made in a more manageable amount of my life. As always, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.